Hello and welcome back. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be painting this very loose, very simple winter scene with you using just one colour, which is one of my favourite colours of all time. It's a student quality colour, but I'm not worried about that because it's pretty light fast, it's got a good permanence rating, and it's made by a very well reputed manufacturer, Winsor & Newton, who make the Cotman range. But of course, that's down to personal choice. If you prefer to use professional or artist quality paints all the time, of course, go for it. I just use whatever colours I like that are made by manufacturers that I trust, and that's good enough for me. Just a quick disclaimer though, I will just say if you try this out with another brand of Payne's Grey, you may not get the same colour splits. And that's the reason I love Cotman Payne's Grey so much. I think it's unique, and I've tried out quite a few and none of them split out in the same way. I'll be using a large flat wash brush. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch Mottler brush, a small rigger brush or lining brush, and a 3/4 inch flat. My paper is Arche, it's rough surface and it's taped to my board, and my board is at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees. But just before I paint, a quick reminder that if you haven't seen it, my book is available to purchase from all good bookstores. I'll leave a couple of links in the description below. There are 10 projects and lots of helpful information. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, then please follow the links below. I'm going to be using the wet in wet method for this painting, and I'm going to be trying to keep it really simple. So to start with, I'm going to wet the paper, and because it's a rough surface textured paper, it takes a little bit more wetting than usual. So I'm going to make sure that the paper is nice and evenly wet throughout. A big brush is really useful for this because you cover the surface of the paper nice and quickly and quite evenly as well. Going back up to the top where maybe the water's running down a little bit, and just making sure that there's no dry patches across the sky. You can see the sheen on the paper. I've brought that down as far as my horizon line and left the rest dry, making sure that by tipping the board up that the water is sort of evenly spread. And here goes my Payne's Grey. When it first goes on, it looks almost black, doesn't it? But as it sort of sits and settles, the pigments will settle sort of out of it into the paper, and of course the blue and black separation of colour will start to happen. So I'm looking for this graduated wash here. I'm going to turn it to the side, so 90 degrees, to allow that paint to sort of flow down and just to settle and diffuse more softly, and I can encourage it gently with my wash brush. Turning it upside down, then dipping straight into some tube consistency Payne's Grey and applying it to the wet wash. I turned it upside down so that when I apply the distant trees, that gravity will help them to run the direction that I want them to, so that they really soften against this wash, but still using the rich paint, it'll hold its own and it won't run off the paper, if you see what I mean. So I'm working sort of to all intents and purposes upside down here, and then just getting rid of a bit of the paint that's on my brush by sweeping some dry brush across the snowy surface. I'll tidy that up in a minute. Now turning the board back around, you can see that my trees are in position and they will continue to soften and diffuse. And now I can just sort of tidy up the snowy midground and foreground, softening back that leading edge, sort of losing the edge there, and then putting in a slightly darker mark where I'm going to have my tree line. Dipping into my rich paint again and establishing my foreground trees. Keeping it nice and rich because I'm going to be using a palette knife to scrape through this paint to sort of draw with the palette knife to draw my branches and tree trunks. But if you don't like that technique, put on slightly less paint, wait till it's completely dry, and then paint in your trunks and branches with a rigger. You can see I'm establishing different size and different shape trees. And now going in with my palette knife and simply drawing through the very rich paint. Two things will happen here. Where the paint is still very wet, where I draw through it with the palette knife, it will create a small scratch, and the water and paint will be drawn into that scratch, and I'll get a dark mark. Where the paint is slightly drier, the palette knife will scrape through the paint and reveal the white paper beneath. So this, to all intents and purposes, is a drawing technique as well as a paint lifting technique. And I will change the shape and the size of my palette knife strokes in order to try to simulate or suggest the way the canopies grow in these different shapes of trees. Just slowly building up the shapes. Trying to keep the pressure nice and light on the palette knife so that my marks aren't too thick, especially towards the ends of the canopies, making sure that the trees kind of link into a stand of trees, but I will be joining them with a little fence a bit later. Again, working on the ground below the trees so that they have a slight shadow or a slight rise in the snow where they're growing from. Then using the flat brush to just soften that mark. I've laid my board flat, and this stops the washes from moving anymore, and I'm going to use some ordinary fine ground table salt and sprinkle that into the foreground, and each little grain of salt will push away a bit of the paint and create a little frost blossom and give me some really pretty texture in the foreground, and it'll create the foreground for me so that the eye is led across that to the stand of trees. If you haven't used the salt technique, or if you're interested in finding out more, then come back on Friday, because I'll be posting a techniques video that you may find interesting, talking all about using salt and particular ways that you can experiment with it. So just going back in as the paper dries to put in some really fine marks, because when the paper is almost dry, I can get those much finer marks. And now putting in the trunks, now that everything's almost dry, with my rigger brush and really thick paint. The reason I waited till this was almost dry was because I didn't want my painted branches to get lost or diffuse too much into the canopies. I want to get a little bit of definition. I'm now going to leave everything to dry completely, and when it's completely dry I can put the fence in. So here's the dry painting, and I've stood it back up to about 20 degrees because I like that angle to paint. I've brushed off the salt from the foreground. You can see it looks really pretty and delicate with those little frost patterns. And I'm using more Payne's Grey and the rigger brush just to sort of work on that tree line and to add the fence posts and the sort of fence wires, keeping it nice and loose, working with the shapes of the trees that are there and using perspective so that the little fence posts will get closer together and smaller as they go into the distance, which this sort of using this slight perspective angle towards a vanishing point on the right gives a little bit of depth and distance to the scene. Trying not to be too particular about these brush strokes, keeping them nice and loose so that this fence has this very sort of loose look to it. And the lights in the studio at the moment are not really showing up the beautiful splits between blue and grey. But once I've removed the tape, now that I've finished the painting, I'll get the painting into a better light so you can see the beautiful split that happens with this particular brand of Payne's Grey, which is of course Winsor & Newton Cotman Payne's Grey. And I'm really pleased with the simplicity here. We've got quite a lot in it. We've got a graduated wash for the sky. We've got a foreground filled with textured snow. A stand of trees in the midground with an old broken down fence. The trees are all slightly different. And then, of course, in the background, we've got this really plain row of distant trees with that gentle blue diffusion around their edges. And I really like that salt effect in the foreground. And if you enjoy that, please don't forget to come back on Friday, where I'll be posting a salt techniques video. Many thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed, why not consider doing so? It really does help with our reach. And you could take a look at our back catalogue. We've got hundreds of videos that you might find really useful, all of them loose and a lot of them very beginner friendly. And if you'd like to support the channel just a little bit more, both Morgana and I have Patreon pages, and the links to those are in the description below. And thank you to everybody that already does support us there. We really appreciate you. So I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.